A widowed nurse adopted a dying man, unaware he was a millionaire with no heirs to inherit. Sarah Matthews tucked this thought away as she adjusted the pillows beneath Mr. Wilson's head, her gentle hands betraying none of the exhaustion that had settled deep in her bones after a 12-hour shift at Mercy General. Outside the hospital window, autumn leaves spiraled to the ground, mirroring how her life had unraveled in the 3 years since David's passing. "You don't have to fuss so much," Mr. Wilson said, his voice a raspy whisper that barely carried across the sterile hospital room. Sarah offered a practiced smile, the kind she'd perfected for patients who needed reassurance more than truth. "It's not fussing if it makes you comfortable, Mr. Wilson. Edward," he corrected, his steel blue eyes finding hers with unexpected clarity. "After 6 weeks of changing my bedpans, I think we're beyond formalities." A small laugh escaped her, the first genuine one in days. "Edward, then." Sarah had been assigned to Edward Wilson's case when he was admitted with late-stage pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was grim. 3 months, perhaps 4, with aggressive palliative care. What had struck her most wasn't his diagnosis, but his solitude. No visitors, no calls, no cards lining his windowsill like the other patients. Just a weathered man of 73 facing the end alone. The evening wind rattled the window as Sarah checked his vitals, making notes in his chart. Edward watched her with that penetrating gaze he sometimes had, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You work too hard," he observed. Sarah tucked the chart under her arm. "Says the man who, according to his admission forms, never took a vacation day in 40 years. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, that she'd remembered such a detail. Work was simpler than the alternative. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken history. Sarah recognized that weight. She carried a similar one. "I understand," she said, and meant it. Their conversations grew longer over the following weeks, brief exchanges expanding into something neither expected. Edward was different from her other patients, perceptive, wry, with a hidden warmth that emerged in quiet moments. He never spoke of family or friends, and Sarah never pressed, though questions lingered. On a particularly brutal November evening, Sarah arrived for her shift to find Edward's room empty, his chart indicating he'd been moved to intensive care after a seizure. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she raced down the corridor, memories of another hospital room, David's last night, threatening to overwhelm her. Edward was pale against the sheets, machines beeping steadily around him, but his eyes opened when she approached. Getting rid of me. That easily," he managed, the ghost of a smile appearing. Relief flooded through her, surprising in its intensity. "Don't joke about that," she said, her voice catching. "You scared me." "Sorry." His hand sought hers, fingers trembling with effort. Sarah took it without hesitation, his skin cool and paper-thin against her palm. "No family to call?" she asked gently. Edward's gaze drifted to the window. "No one who would come." The admission settled between them, and Sarah felt something shift in her chest, recognition of a shared solitude that somehow made her own less crushing. 3 days later, Dr. Patel caught her after rounds. "Wilson's condition is deteriorating faster than expected. He'll need hospice care, but he's refusing." "Why?" Sarah asked, concern creasing her brow. "He says he won't die among strangers." "Doctor." Patel's expression softened. "He's asking for you, Sarah." In Edward's room, machines hummed in the background as he looked up at her with resolute eyes. "I don't want to die in some facility," he stated simply. "Edward, I've made my peace with dying, just not with how." His voice strengthened with conviction. "I have money for private care. I just need somewhere that isn't here." The words tumbled from Sarah's lips before she fully processed them. "You could come home with me." Surprise registered on his face, mirroring her own internal reaction. But as the suggestion hung in the air, Sarah realized she meant it. "I'm a nurse. I have the training. My house is empty except for me and too many memories." She swallowed. "You wouldn't be alone." Edward studied her for a long moment, his eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. "Why would you do that for me?" Sarah thought of her empty house, the silence that greeted her each night, the photos she'd turned face down because looking at David's smile hurt too much. She thought of Edward's quiet dignity in the face of death and the unexpected comfort their conversations had brought her. "Because no one should die alone," she answered, then more honestly, "and maybe I'm tired of being alone too." The process was surprisingly straightforward. Edward signed himself out against medical advice, but with a comprehensive home care plan. Sarah took emergency family leave, arranged for visiting specialists, and transformed her guest bedroom into a comfortable space for Edward. On the day she brought him home, snow was falling, the first of the season. Fat, silent flakes drifted past her windows as she helped him settle into bed. "It's not much," she apologized, glancing around the modest room she'd prepared. Edward's gaze traveled slowly around the space, the freshly painted walls, the reading lamp positioned perfectly beside the bed, the stack of books she'd noticed him reading at the hospital. "It's perfect," he said, and something in his voice made her look away before he could see the moisture gathering in her eyes. The first week established their routine. Mornings began with medication, gentle stretches, and breakfast if he could manage it. Afternoons often found them in the living room, Sarah reading aloud while Edward drifted between sleep and wakefulness. Evenings were for documentary programs he enjoyed or sometimes just quiet conversation. "Tell me about him," Edward said one night, nodding toward the photograph Sarah had finally turned face up on the mantel. She tensed, her hands stilling on the blanket she was adjusting across his lap. "David?" Edward nodded. "You don't have to. But sometimes speaking memories aloud keeps them alive a little longer." The gentleness in his voice unraveled something tightly bound inside her. That night, Sarah spoke of David for the first time without feeling like she was being torn apart. Their college meeting, their small wedding, his unexpected heart attack at 42. As words spilled out, she realized she was telling stories she'd forgotten she remembered. Edward listened with a quiet attention that felt like a gift. "He sounds like a good man," he said when she finally fell silent. "He was." Sarah wiped away tears that had fallen without her noticing. "Your turn. Who was Edward Wilson before I met him?" A shadow crossed his face. "Someone who made every mistake possible." Gradually, in the dark hours when pain kept him awake, Edward's story emerged in fragments. The son of a factory worker who'd built a construction empire through relentless work. A marriage that crumbled under the weight of his ambition. A daughter who'd cut contact after years of broken promises. "Jennifer would be about your age now," he said, looking at Sarah with an expression that made her heart ache. "I tried finding her a few years back. She'd changed her name, moved overseas." "You could try again," Sarah suggested gently. Edward shook his head. "Some bridges stay burned. That's the price of learning too late what matters." As December deepened, so did their connection. Edward's physical decline was steady, but his mind remained sharp, his insights often catching Sarah off guard. He noticed things about her that even David sometimes hadn't. How she hummed when worried, how she saved the cookie edges for last, how sunrise through the kitchen window could momentarily transport her somewhere else. Christmas approached, and though neither mentioned it, Sarah found herself adding small touches to the house. A pine wreath, cinnamon candles, lights strung along the fireplace mantel. She hadn't decorated since David died. One afternoon, returning from picking up Edward's medications, she found him sitting up in the wheelchair they now used to move between rooms. He was pale with exertion but smiling. "I have a confession," he said. "I asked the home health aide to help me with something." Sarah followed his gaze to the coffee table where a small package sat wrapped in silver paper. "Edward, you didn't need—" "Humor a dying man," he interrupted, his tone light despite the words. With hesitant fingers, she unwrapped the gift to find a leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. "You mentioned once that you used to write," Edward explained. "Before nursing, before David's death. I thought perhaps it was time to find that part of yourself again." Sarah ran her fingers over the smooth leather, emotions constricting her throat. "I don't know if I remember how—" "You do," he said simply. "You've been telling me stories for weeks now. They just need somewhere to live besides memory." That night, after Edward had fallen asleep, Sarah opened the journal. Her pen hovered over the blank page until finally, words began to flow. Not about David or grief, but about an unexpected friendship with a dying man who had somehow reawakened parts of her she thought had died years ago. Christmas Eve arrived with a heavy snowfall that blanketed the world in hushed white. Edward's condition had worsened, each breath a visible effort, but he insisted on being moved to the living room where the tree lights reflected in the window glass. "I have another request," he said as Sarah adjusted his oxygen. "In my suitcase, there's a red folder." She found it tucked between his sparse belongings, a worn leather folder containing legal papers. Edward's hands trembled as he took it from her. "I've been meaning to discuss this." he began, then paused for a labored breath. "I've made arrangements for after I'm gone." "Edward, we don't need to—" "We do." His voice was gentle but firm. "I've updated my will." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. "That's your private business." "Not entirely." Edward opened the folder, revealing documents bearing official seals. "I've named you as my beneficiary." The words didn't register at first, floating disconnected in the air between them. "That's not—" "I never expected—" Sarah stammered, heat rising to her face. "I didn't take you in for—" "I know." Edward's interruption was soft. "That's precisely why I'm doing this." He explained in his methodical way. The construction company he'd built sold before his diagnosis for an amount that made Sarah's head swim. The investment portfolio, the properties, all of it managed through a trust that would now pass to her. "I don't understand," she whispered, overwhelmed. "You must have family, distant relatives." "None who showed me what family truly means." His eyes, though tired, were clear and certain. "You took in a dying stranger and gave him the most precious thing, dignity at the end. A home. Anyone would have—" "No." The word was firm. "Most wouldn't. You saw a person, not just a patient. You listened. You cared when there was nothing to gain." A smile touched his lips. "Though I suppose now there is something to gain." Sarah shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "I don't need your money, Edward." "Consider it an investment, then," he replied. "In whatever brings you back to life. Your writing, travel, a clinic of your own. Whatever dreams you set aside." He reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Promise me you won't refuse this. Promise you'll use it to find joy again." Looking into his eyes, earnest, determined, kind, Sarah found she couldn't deny him. "I promise." That night, as snow continued to fall outside, they sat together watching the Christmas lights twinkle. Sarah read aloud from A Christmas Carol, Edward's favorite, his breathing growing more labored but his attention never wavering. Near midnight, he spoke suddenly. "Thank you for giving me a home at the end." Sarah's voice caught. "Thank you for helping me remember what home feels like." Edward Wilson passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 days after Christmas. Sarah was holding his hand, reading from the journal she'd begun filling with stories. Their stories. As his breathing slowed and finally stilled, she finished the page she was reading, then gently closed the book. "Goodbye, my friend," she whispered. The funeral was small. Hospital colleagues who'd known Edward briefly, a few neighbors who'd met him during his short stay with Sarah. But as she stood beside the grave, Sarah noticed a woman lingering at the edge of the gathering, her posture hesitant, her features hauntingly familiar. After the service, Sarah approached her. "You're Jennifer." Surprise flickered across the woman's face. "How did you—" "Your father described you perfectly." Sarah gestured to a nearby bench. "Would you like to sit?" They talked for hours, there in the cemetery as winter sunlight faded. Jennifer explained how she'd seen Edward's obituary online, how she'd flown in from London with a heart full of complicated grief and unfinished conversations. "He looked for you," Sarah told her. "He regretted the time lost." Jennifer wiped away tears. "I was too stubborn to respond when his letters came. Now it's too late." "Maybe not entirely," Sarah said, reaching into her bag for Edward's journal, a matching companion to her own that she'd discovered among his things after his death. "He wrote to you, even when he couldn't send the words." The months that followed brought changes Sarah could never have imagined. The inheritance Edward left was substantial enough to be overwhelming, but she approached it with the same care she'd shown him, deliberate choices, meaningful investments. She established a foundation in Edward's name, focusing on end-of-life care for those without family support. She funded nursing scholarships at the local college. And eventually, she opened a small hospice house where the dying could spend their final days in a home-like setting, surrounded by care and dignity. Jennifer returned to help, bringing her expertise in international healthcare administration. Together, they built something that honored Edward's memory while creating a future neither had envisioned. 1 year after Edward's death, Sarah sat in her study, finishing the final pages of a manuscript, a memoir of that transformative winter and the unexpected friendship that had changed everything. Outside, spring rain tapped against the windows, the sound reminding her of Edward's fingers drumming thoughtfully against his book cover when a passage moved him. Her gaze fell on the photograph she kept on her desk, not the one of David, which now sat comfortably on the mantel as part of her past, but a newer one, herself and Edward in the living room on Christmas Eve, snow falling outside the window, both smiling despite everything. Sarah had learned that grief and joy could coexist, that endings sometimes contained beginnings, and that family could be found in the most unexpected circumstances. A widowed nurse had adopted a dying man, unaware he was a millionaire with no heirs to inherit. But what she'd actually inherited wasn't measured in money at all. It was purpose, connection, and the courage to live fully again. She wrote the final sentence of her manuscript, then closed the leather journal Edward had given her. Outside, the rain had stopped, and sunlight was breaking through the clouds. Sarah stood and moved to the window, watching as light transformed ordinary puddles into momentary mirrors reflecting the brightening sky. It was time to begin another day in the life Edward had helped her reclaim, not as a replacement for what she'd lost, but as a gift she'd never expected to receive. A second chance built on kindness, forged in grief, and ultimately defined by love.